How far would you trust Vladimir Putin? About as far as you could throw him, I can hear you. Well, we're hearing that Russia is shifting focus in its war with Ukraine, shifting focus. They seem to have backed right off the capital, Kiev, and will continue with the so-called liberation of the contested Donbass region. Now, it could be a sign that Russia has conceded defeat in the central and western parts of Ukraine and will relegate itself to taking control of the eastern region, the part they've been occupying since around 2014. If only they'd not underestimated how hard Ukrainians would fight and how united the rest of the world would become to isolate Russia from the world. Tens of thousands of lives and many hundreds of square kilometres of property could have been saved. But let's not be fooled here. Overnight, 2 separate missile strikes hit an oil depot and oil plant in residential areas on the edge of the city of Lviv. Now, this is the city which has been unofficially earmarked as the exit gateway for humanitarian cases, refugees. So they've still got no qualms about taking innocent lives. So who knows what Putin is up to? Is it a complete reset? And for those under siege, you can imagine how they would be feeling on receiving the news. They would be hoping that this is the beginning of a victory, albeit at a great loss to human life, property and their history. Meanwhile, US President Joe Biden has left Poland. A fat lot of good it was to even send Biden to Warsaw or the Ukrainian border. His first major public statement at the beginning of the weekend was so incredibly weak.
Did you ask me whether I was involved?
A war criminal, sir.
I think he is a war criminal.
Will you be meeting with him?
How's that? He thinks Putin is a war criminal. The whole world knows that scoop. We've all seen the hospitals and the schools bombed endlessly. Is that all he had? Putin thinks Biden is a joke. This is the US president who in December assured the Russians that the US would not engage militarily if Russia invaded Ukraine. The big green light flashed back then in December, and Putin instantly sent in many more thousands of troops to prepare for the next invasion. But on Biden's second day in Poland, someone who actually runs US foreign policy has obviously got into his ear, and the president lifted his voice and cranked up the rhetoric.
We will have a different future, a brighter future, rooted in democracy and principle, hope and light, of decency and dignity, of freedom and possibilities. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power.
What were the commitments
What is
with
this? I mean,
Ukraine?
you see this, and you're dealing every day with Vladimir Putin. I mean, look at what he's done to these people. What does it make you think?
He's a butcher.
He's a butcher. So he's cranked up the rhetoric, but he also said, for God's sake, he should not be in power. Even when he tries to correct his earlier address, he stuffs it up. It sounded like Biden was calling for a regime change in Russia. But directly after the speech, the White House was forced to correct Joe's language, claiming that he was making the point that Putin cannot be allowed to exercise power over his neighbours or the region. That's not what I heard. Again, he stumbles his way through some of the most important chapters in world history. He's a complete klutz. But on the other side of the fence, what was British Prime Minister Boris Johnson doing when Biden was stumbling off script? Well, he was on the phone to Beijing discussing China's influence over Russia. For 50 minutes, he implored Xi Jinping to get off the fence and speak to Vladimir Putin about leaving Ukraine now. It was described as a frank and candid conversation, and I just reckon it was probably far more effective right now than standing on the Polish border for a picture opportunity and calling Putin a butcher. And late last week, Johnson was on the front foot again, trying to convince NATO allies to provide more help to Ukraine by supplying President Volodymyr Zelensky with NATO tanks. What a game changer that would be. But guess who stood in the way of aiding Ukraine by sending in tanks? The French. Yes, French President Emmanuel Macron went to water. He wouldn't dare upset Putin in that way. He categorically rejected the idea of providing Ukraine with tanks and described Johnson's push as, wait for it, the crossing of a red line. Of course, Boris reminded NATO that Russia was adopting an absolutely barbaric use of artillery, mortars and rockets, including thermobaric bombs. In other words, it's Putin that has crossed the red line, and the world should not allow Putin to get away with it. I know who the adult in this war room still is, and it's not Joe Biden. It is Boris Johnson. But watch this space carefully. This war is at a critical turning point. You can't trust Vladimir Putin as far as you can throw him. But maybe by the time we return at this time next week, we will have a general idea and a better idea of how this terrible war might come to a conclusion.